Hello and welcome to CNBC-TV18's continuing coverage here from the B20 Summit. I'm Shireen Khan, and joining me now is the team from McKinsey to talk about a report that they've put out, which essentially talks about moving from poverty to empowerment, raising the bar for sustainable and inclusive growth. Swen, Anu, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. I want to start by talking to you about that. As we heard from the B20 chair N. Chandrasekharan this morning, that across all the 9 themes, the 172 policy actions and the 54 recommendations, the core theme has been inclusion and more inclusion. I want to understand from you why you believe that that is so critical. Why is this a pivotal decade for us to take that inclusion agenda forward?
So thank you, Shireen. If you think about what we have in our mind about poverty, it's the old poverty line, the $1 that has become more than 2. But for that, you basically have basic food and a little bit of shelter. You don't have real education, real health, and so on. And the people that live below the poverty line or close to the poverty line are really not yet empowered to be part of society. But our work on sustainable inclusive growth says that if you even want to achieve sustainability, the people actually need to be part of society first and participate before they can handle that challenge. And then the other thing it says is growth is good for all of that. Because it will help people to become empowered and it will help to finance the transition. And this idea that you can solve this puzzle only in one corner, we try to sort of say is different. And it really feels different at empowerment of $12 a day versus $2 a day. At $12 a day, you have food, shelter, education, and healthcare, and a little bit of discretionary spend. So you can become part of society and live to your full potential.
2 to 12, Anu, that is a big jump. It requires a big shift. Now, what is going to make it happen?
It is a big shift, Shireen. Our numbers would suggest that the increase in spending power required to take 4.7 billion people on this planet to the level of empowerment in a 10-year period is roughly equal to 4% of global GDP each year. That's $37 trillion in total. And if you add to that what's required to step up net zero related energy investments, that's another 4%. So 8% of global GDP is a big number. But the good news is that growth and business-led innovation can actually address almost half this total need, particularly on the empowerment side. It can be as much as 2/3 of this step up, that accelerated economic growth, productivity growth, opening up new kinds of work opportunities for people and upskilling them to take those. The stuff that businesses can do can really deliver 2/3 of this empowerment gap. And then with growth and innovation comes technology improvements that can reduce the cost of the energy transition and meet as much as 40% of the other gap. So put together, I think the biggest priority for countries around the world really needs to be to continue harnessing those growth opportunities that businesses can lead.
Well, speaking about the growth opportunities and being able to address this big gap from 2 to 12 that you speak of, just in terms of financing, and you gave us some perspective on how we can meet the financing needs. But let's break it up into government and the private sector. And let's start by talking about what the government can do and what the government should prioritize in terms of capital allocation, specifically in the context of even a country like India.
So all the things that help stimulate productivity, whether that's infrastructure, technology, education, are going to be helpful to make this step towards empowerment possible. Because you need more productive work. We know that productivity potential exists. Lots of our work suggests we can automate half of the work and they basically double the output per worker. We just need to get that done. And that does require these auxiliary benefits of education, technology, and infrastructure, which is usually where the government does that. Which, and by the way, there will be some deregulation also that will help businesses to step up to their growth challenge.
Anu, the role of the government and the role of the private sector. Uday Kotak this morning spoke about getting everybody globally, corporations to put away 0.2% of their profit towards social development needs, similar to what we have with the 2% CSR norm here in India. How do you believe the private sector can pitch in from a financing point of view?
The private sector is central and crucial to delivering empowerment. That's something we believe, and our numbers bear it out as well. This is not a nice to have or being a good citizen. This is the intrinsic work that businesses do, which is putting capital to work to open up a lot of work opportunities for people. It's the organic process in which people learn skills by doing things and move up the income ladder that way. And that's the process really that governments can enable by making labor markets more healthy, more flexible, to give people that kind of upward mobility. And the private sector can do best what it does best, which is focus on growth opportunities and focus on technological innovation to bring down costs, not just of energy-related technologies, but a whole host of the essentials, affordable housing, affordable and quality healthcare. There are all these new models that you can actually bring, which reduce the cost of being an empowered citizen by making those services more available and accessible to the broad mass of people. And that's really where the private sector can lead.
But how optimistic or confident do you feel about getting this global cooperation really going in so many of these areas that are going to be critical for us to be able to go from 2 to 12? I mean, I'll use the example of the pandemic. We couldn't finance the vaccine needs of the world. We were far short of what the world needed in terms of the vaccine inequities being bridged. So what gives you the confidence of being able to get this done, in your words?
I have multiple sources of confidence. I would say the inequity of the vaccine point, I can really make a point. But if you look at the pandemic mobilization, it's been one of the largest. It's actually more than an example, but we need to maintain that for decades rather than just for 2 years, that level of mobilization. But then if you look at India or other countries that are basically moving up the growth ladder, if India maintains 6, 7, 8% growth for a decade, it will do a lot to solve this empowerment gap. And I think we need to just stop being hesitant about growth. I don't think that's an Indian thing, but coming from the West, there's hesitation because its growth leads to climate change, therefore you can't. And we think the biggest mistake that we're making right now is to solve these things in silos. Climate change, equity, growth. The real reality is if that total engine works, the whole thing can work much better. And we will actually progress to abundance over time, because that's the possibility of society.
You know, that's the interesting point that you made, that a lot of the solutions lie in the intersectionality of each of these large areas and large transitions that we are in the midst of. So if I were to ask you for key policy interventions that will look at laying out an inclusion roadmap that focuses on the intersectionalities, what would you recommend?
Well, I think the first step in that is to recognize and quantify and make more granular your understanding of these intersectionalities. So if you think about the net zero transition, there's a whole host of sectors and technologies where we need progress, but they all aren't the same in terms of whether they're really in the money yet or are likely to be in the money, versus will actually need substantial public capital or public commitment to make them viable and cost competitive. And in our research, we actually break that down in a lot of granularity. We think there's something like $10 trillion of potentially in the money investments that can be made. But for the rest, that's where public finance needs to really dissect and prioritize and figure out the most affordable pieces where a blended finance approach can be put to work to crowd in more private capital. So the devil's in the detail, but there is a lot of work that can be done in terms of figuring out how best to deploy that public finance and public capital in order to make sort of the private sector then spur even more innovation and bring down costs and raise capital even more.
So in the Indian context, what would it mean specifically?
So in the Indian context, the in the money component is already considerable. I think the numbers are something like $2 trillion worth of incremental spending and investment on EVs, on parts of solar, renewables, wind, and so on. But T&D, which is all of the modernization of the grid and making it renewables ready, that is a huge component of investment which will not be in the money on its own. And I think public capital will have to play a role very strategically there. But if it did that, then that could spur much more innovation in the rest of the ecosystem. So it's opportunities of that kind.
You know, speaking about opportunities, but also about acknowledging the distance for many different geographies and many different countries to be able to meet the empowerment line. I mean, India would be very different from countries in Africa, for instance. Sure. What is the role then of multilateral agencies, of multilateral aid, as we speak about it in the context of making this shift?
So the first thing that we hope, and we already see the word empowerment in many other places, is that the world actually shifts the bar from 2 to 12. Because once the conversation is at 12 for Africa, India, and everywhere, we are going to have very different solutions. Because a silo solution of, for example, climate change would be to do it at any cost and to ask every country to do it at any cost. That's not fair to India, that's not fair to Africa. The real reality is we need to solve that system. And if the world would just raise its question from 2 to 12, and every time it makes a decision, is this something that supports the 12 and growth and climate? We have a very different answer than if we only solve for the 2 and climate change.
What's the sense you get? Is the world ready to move from 2 to 12? Do you believe that there's going to be a buy-in? Because it will require every government, private sector in different countries to make those decisions that are crucial.
I think people are already there. So I think people have set their aspirations at something more than exiting poverty. The world has made tremendous progress on exiting extreme poverty over the last 2 or 3 decades, and that's to be lauded. But
we've
that's
also
not
seen
enough.
income inequality.
Income inequality has risen, but more importantly, there are billions of people who are still not at the level of full empowerment, and making concerted progress to address those aspirations, we feel is something that both business leaders and policymakers are very seized of. So I think people are there, but what's needed is really getting more grounded and concrete in terms of what does it mean and where are the pockets where you can go forward and actually make progress in an economically viable way quickly.
Somebody walked in as part of the conversations that we were having and said, look, all of this is great, but what do we do to ensure that this doesn't become another talk show? So what do we do in terms of tangible, concrete next steps to ensure that this is not just a headline?
So one of the things that we are progressing, and we were talking about a little bit, is that the world's now pursuing hundreds of metrics across all the goals. Why not start with 2 or 3? And of course, then there's the hygiene of clean water and all that kind of stuff. But if the world is empowered, it will have the wealth to actually support all the other agendas. Whereas if you force the other agendas before people are empowered, they can't participate. And I think we currently have this dichotomy where the North says, oh, we're already there. Why don't you go also do what we want? But the people are not there. They can't be there because they're not. So to me, it would actually simplify the agenda dramatically. If you say we have these dual challenges that are all enabled by growth and health, and that would change the world already a lot compared to every micro fight everywhere.
It's a big battle. There's many, in fact, I mean, within the larger battle, there's many mini battles. But as Sven said, if you had to pick 2 or 3 fronts that you believe people need to focus on today, what would those be?
I would go back to this idea that what's embedded in empowerment is that the consumption levels of the bottom half of the population need to rise. And we think that fully half of that needs to come through the process of better paying jobs, because jobs have to be fundamentally more productive and people have to move into those jobs. So doing what we can to unlock more productive manufacturing, trade and services that are more value adding in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, in every other developing country, to really focus on job creation and the ability of people to take those jobs to raise their consumption.
And let me just add to that, that if you embrace that 50% of this can be done by businesses, that in many worlds is called living wages as part of what multinationals do. But it also means get out of the way a little bit so that these businesses can do it. It's not anti-capitalist to go from 2 to 12. Capitalism will actually help do that.
But where do you believe government is in the way to do?
I think there is in general, and on the if you look at why productivity is held back, one is capital deepening, which is are we spending enough capex to produce productive goods? But there's also regulation, whether it's permitting of the new technologies, of the rollout of new technologies, whether it's regulation on experimentation and so on, risk and returns, and so that just make life a little more complex. If you believe growth is going to be the unlock, Don't be hesitant, move it, and then have the people become the people that you want them to be, which are rich and empowered, so that they can be part of this more rich, balanced society in all the criteria.
You know, I don't know if there's anyone in the world at this point in time that's hesitant to want to grow. I think, the appetite to want to grow, at least here in a market like India,
Here,
is
it's
significant.
perfect. Yeah.
But you're saying that Europe doesn't have the growth aspiration?
I'd say the Western world is hesitant on growth.
It's
Because
hesitant.
it basically says, due to growth, we will get more footprint and more climate change problems. The data that we have in this report shows the opposite. If you grow faster, you do get a bit, that's an interaction, you
But
get
then
a
you
bit more
also-
footprint,
yeah.
but you get so much more money to finance transition that the transition becomes easier. Every point of growth you lose will make the transition harder. Which is a counterintuitive thing, because you have this instinct, it makes the climate transition worse. And I think if we were to embrace that, the entire engine would just run differently if it were to run at 1 or 2% more growth for the whole world.
Well, that's certainly something that I think everyone will be looking forward to, is a higher growth rate. But at this point in time, India aspiring for 7%, we're not even talking about double digit. And somebody in fact tweeted to me this morning saying, when did we become okay with just 6 or 7% growth, which is great. But I think there's also been a rescaling of growth expectations globally, given the current realities, right?
Yes.
No, that's certainly true. I think we are looking at a global baseline growth of about 2.7%. And some might argue that that's lower now than what it was a year ago or 2 years ago. But the point is that there is so much productivity potential to raise that 2.7% up by another percentage point, for example. And doing that has so much of potential value that it can deliver to this cause of empowerment and accelerating net zero at the same time, that it doesn't matter whether it's 6%, 7% or 8%. It really is about building on what you have and raising the growth, harnessing those productivity opportunities to the most extent possible.
So what's the biggest risk or risks that you see in being able to cover this distance from 2 to 12?
The biggest risk, I would say, is that the hesitance to growth in the West. Because and the West is so much still of the economy, if that whole thing holds it back, it will then not have the financial capacity to help, it will not have the financial capacity to do it in their own country. My country still has an empowerment gap. The US still has an empowerment gap. And so that is, to me, a large risk. But the other one that we want to pose is not solving this puzzle as a system is going to be a large risk. Because then what you will do is you will do the transition at any cost, at any moment, which will basically crowd out the empowerment. Whereas if you do it in the right sequence with a affordable transition, you'll also feel the empowerment and keep the engine of growth going. So we need to get this engine running. There's 3 things that we need to hold. I have only 2 hands.
So the growth hesitation, the key challenge as far as the developed world is concerned, they're not stepping on the gas, unintended, as hard as they should be. But what about India? What would be the key risk here?
Well, I think the other risk I would add from a Western perspective is the transition at any cost risk.
Yeah.
But for countries like India and many other developing countries, I also think it's empowerment at any cost is a risk. You have to think about empowerment that is fueled by the very sustainable and enduring engine of growth, productivity, better jobs. That's the heart of it. Social safety nets, public transfers can play a role, but growth, productive jobs, and getting people to occupy those jobs is crucial. So the labor markets have to work and fuel empowerment.
I think maybe I'll just add one thing to that. Is I believe fundamentally that if you solve the right question, the world will get it right. If you solve the wrong question, so if you're only solving sustainability, you're going to solve the wrong question.
Yeah.
If you only solve growth, it's the wrong one. If you only solve economic inclusion, it's the wrong one. If the question is we solve all of these 3 at the same time, our report only shows the full pathway to maybe 50% of this. So the other 50 is still a gap. We're not saying that we have the answers to that, but we do believe if the world changes the question from 2 to 12 to all 3 at the same time without hesitance or growth, we are going to together solve the right question. And then the world will be humanity as it is. It can answer questions.
Well, to be able to put together an appropriate prescription, you have to first identify and diagnose the right problem.
Exactly.
And that is what the hope is with this report, as well as a roadmap on how the world can make the transition from $2 to $12 a day. That is the empowerment line that McKinsey is proposing. Swen and Anu, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. We will, of course, check in with you as progress is made on the execution aspect of this report and the recommendations that you put forward.